You know, there's something rather curious about this whole business of spiritual secrets. People come to me and ask, "Alan, what are the hidden truths that only the awakened know?" And I have to laugh because the question itself reveals a fundamental misunderstanding. These aren't secrets in the sense of information being deliberately withheld, like some sort of spiritual conspiracy. Rather, they're insights that simply can't be communicated to someone who isn't ready to hear them. Not because we're being exclusive, but because words fail utterly to convey what can only be known through direct experience. Let me put it to you this way. If you've had what we might call a genuine spiritual awakening, you've likely discovered that trying to explain it to others often creates more confusion than clarity. It's not that you want to keep secrets, it's that you've realized certain truths are like trying to describe the color blue to someone who has never seen. The description, no matter how eloquent, will never substitute for the direct seeing. Now here's where it gets interesting. What I'm going to share with you isn't really 5 secrets at all. It's more like 5 realizations about why awakened awareness can't be packaged and delivered like information, and why your attempts to share it with everyone you meet will likely end in frustration for both you and them. You see, most people are operating under a set of assumptions about reality that are so fundamental, so deeply embedded that they don't even recognize them as assumptions. They think these assumptions are simply how things are. And when you come along with your awakened perspective, challenging these basic premises, it's not just that they disagree with you, it's that they literally cannot understand what you're saying, because the conceptual framework required to grasp it doesn't exist in their mental landscape yet. The first thing you've probably discovered, if you've had this awakening, is that the separate self is a fiction. Not a half-truth, not a metaphor, but an actual fiction. You've seen through the illusion that you are a separate entity, isolated inside your skin, looking out at a world that is fundamentally other than you. You've realized that this sense of being a separate observer, this little man inside your head pulling the levers, is a construct, a story, a habit of thought rather than an actual thing. But here's the predicament. When you try to tell someone else that they don't exist as they think they do, what do they hear? They hear that you're telling them they don't exist at all, which sounds either absurd or threatening. They think you're saying their experiences aren't real, their thoughts don't matter, their feelings are invalid. This couldn't be further from what you're actually pointing to, but the words themselves create this confusion, because they're being filtered through the very illusion you're trying to point beyond. The separate self isn't something that needs to be destroyed or gotten rid of. That would be like trying to get rid of a mirage in the desert by walking over to it and stamping on it. What you've realized is that it was never there in the first place, except as an appearance, a way of interpreting experience. The person you're talking to is still completely identified with this appearance, and suggesting it isn't real feels like an existential threat. The second realization you've likely had is that nothing is happening to you, but rather everything is happening as you. You've seen that there's no separation between the awareness that witnesses experience and the experience itself. The witness and the witnessed are one movement, one process, like the ocean and its waves. You are not a separate awareness, observing your life from some removed vantage point. You are the totality of what's happening, including the apparent observer. But try explaining this to someone who is utterly convinced that they are the thinker of their thoughts, the doer of their actions, the one in control. They experience themselves as the author of their story, the decision maker, the one who must figure everything out and make everything happen. When you suggest that thoughts think themselves, that actions arise spontaneously, that control is an illusion, they hear only chaos and meaninglessness. They can't yet see what you've seen, which is that the surrender of the illusion of control doesn't lead to chaos, but to a profound relaxation. Life goes on perfectly well, perhaps even better, when you stop pretending to be the separate controller of your experience. But this is something that must be discovered directly. Describing it is like describing the taste of honey to someone who has never tasted it. The words are just symbols, pointing to an experience that must be had firsthand. The third insight you've probably stumbled upon is that time, as we normally conceive it, is a mental construct. There is only now. The past exists only as a present memory. The future exists only as a present anticipation or imagination. All of your actual living happens in this eternal present moment. Yet most people spend their entire lives mentally living either in the past or the future, never quite here. When you've awakened to this, you've realized that the present moment isn't a thin slice between past and future. It's all there is. It's the only place where life actually occurs. And in this realization, there's an extraordinary freedom. Regret about the past and anxiety about the future lose their grip because you see them for what they are, present thoughts about imaginary times. But when you try to convey this to someone who is deeply identified with their psychological time, with their story of who they were and who they will be, it sounds like you're telling them to abandon all planning, all learning from experience, all working toward goals. They think you're advocating for a kind of reckless, irresponsible immediacy. They don't yet understand that recognizing the primacy of now doesn't negate functional use of memory and planning. It just means you don't get lost in psychological time, to the point where you miss the only moment that's actually real. The fourth realization that can't really be shared is the recognition that you are not your thoughts. You are the awareness in which thoughts appear. You've discovered that thoughts arise spontaneously, like weather patterns in the sky of consciousness. You don't create them any more than you create the clouds. You are the space in which they appear and disappear. This is profound because it means you can observe your thoughts without being controlled by them. You can watch the mental commentary, the judgments, the fears, the desires, and recognize them as passing phenomena rather than as truth or as yourself. But when someone is completely identified with their thinking, when they believe they are the voice in their head, this idea sounds impossible or even frightening. They might say, "But if I'm not my thoughts, then who am I? If I can't trust my thinking, how do I function?" And you see, they're still thinking about it, still trying to grasp it conceptually, which is precisely the problem. The recognition of yourself as awareness rather than as thoughts isn't something you figure out. It's something you notice when the mind becomes quiet enough to see its own activity. The fifth insight, and perhaps the most paradoxical, is that there's nothing to attain and nowhere to go. You are already it. What you've been seeking has been here all along. The awakened state isn't something you achieve in the future, through enough meditation, enough purification, enough spiritual practice. It's the recognition of what's already present, what you've always been. But this is perhaps the most frustrating thing to try to communicate, because everyone who comes to spirituality comes with the deep assumption that they are broken and need to be fixed, that they are ignorant and need to become enlightened, that they are here and need to get there. The entire spiritual seeking industry is built on this assumption. And when you say, there's nowhere to go, nothing to achieve, you already are what you're seeking. It sounds like you're telling them to give up, to stop trying, to settle for their current state of suffering. What they can't yet see is that the seeking itself is what obscures the recognition. It's like looking everywhere for your glasses while they're on your head. The moment you stop searching, there they are. But you can't just tell someone to stop seeking if their entire identity is wrapped up in being a seeker. They have to exhaust the search to see its futility through their own experience. You see, none of these realizations can be handed over like giving someone a book or teaching them a skill. They're not information. They're transformations in the way reality is perceived. And transformations can't be forced or rushed. They happen in their own time, when the conditions are right, when the person is ready. Perhaps you've had the experience of trying to share your awakening with a friend or family member and watching their eyes glaze over, or seeing them become defensive, or having them think you've joined some cult or had a breakdown. It's not that they're stupid or resistant. It's that their entire framework for understanding reality would have to shift to accommodate what you're pointing to. And that shift can't be made intellectually. The interesting thing is that everyone has actually experienced these truths already in fleeting moments. Moments of complete presence where time seemed to stop. Moments of ego dissolution in the face of great beauty or danger. Moments of unconditional love where the boundary between self and other disappeared. Everyone has touched this awakened awareness. but they've dismissed these moments as unusual states rather than recognizing them as glimpses of what's fundamentally true. What you've done in awakening is simply stopped dismissing these moments. You've recognized them as more real than the conventional state of contracted, separate selfhood. You've seen that what you thought was normal waking consciousness is actually a kind of trance, a socially conditioned dream of separation and time and control. So why keep these realizations to yourself? Not because you're being exclusive or elitist, but because sharing them prematurely with people who aren't asking often causes harm rather than help. It can make people feel judged, as if you're claiming to be superior. It can make them feel their own suffering is being invalidated. It can trigger defensive reactions that actually reinforce the very illusions you're trying to point beyond. The paradox is that the more truly awakened you are, the less compelled you feel to talk about it anyway. You don't need to convince anyone of anything because you're not seeking validation for your realization. You can meet people exactly where they are, speak their language, honor their journey, without needing them to see what you see. And yet, there's a natural sharing that happens, not through preaching or teaching, but through being. Your presence itself, when it's rooted in awakened awareness, communicates something that words cannot. People sense it, even if they can't articulate it. Your lack of defensiveness, your ease with uncertainty, your freedom from the need to be right, your ability to be fully present, these things are far more eloquent than any explanation. So, when should you share these insights? When someone genuinely asks, when they're truly ready to hear, when they've come to the end of their own seeking and are open to the possibility that the answer isn't more information but a fundamental shift in perspective. Then your words might serve as a pointer, a catalyst, a permission to see what they're already on the verge of seeing. But even then, be humble about it. Remember that you're not giving them enlightenment. You're not even giving them truth. You're simply sharing your own seeing, knowing full well that they must do their own seeing. As the old Zen saying goes, the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon. Your words, no matter how clear, are just fingers pointing. They must look for themselves. The other reason to be cautious about broadcasting these realizations is that the spiritual ego is a tricky thing. When you first wake up to these truths, there can be a subtle pride, a sense of, I've got it, and others don't. This is just the ego dressed in spiritual clothes, and it's one of the more dangerous traps on the path. If you go around sharing your awakening with everyone, you might be feeding this spiritual ego rather than expressing genuine compassion. True awakening includes the recognition that there's no one here who has awakened. Awakening is impersonal. It's not that you became enlightened, it's that the illusion of you as a separate entity fell away, revealing what was always true. When this is really seen, there's no one left to be proud of their spiritual attainment. Another aspect of this that's worth considering is that people on the spiritual path often go through a phase of intense enthusiasm where they want to share everything they're learning with everyone they meet. This is natural and understandable, but it often alienates more than it illuminates. People who haven't asked for spiritual teachings don't want to hear them, especially not over dinner or at a party. There's a time for speaking and a time for silence. There's a time for teaching and a time for simply being. As you mature in your awakening, you develop a sensitivity to when words are useful and when they're just noise. You learn to trust the intelligence of timing, to wait for the moment when your insight might actually land rather than just bounce off someone's defensive walls. And here's something else you've probably noticed. The truths that seemed so clear and revolutionary when you first awakened become, over time, increasingly ordinary. Not because they're less true, but because they become integrated. They become how you see, rather than what you see. And when that happens, there's less impulse to talk about them because they're no longer special. They're just reality. This is actually a sign of deeper integration. The person who won't shut up about their spiritual awakening is often still viewing it as something separate from ordinary life, as a special state or achievement. But when awakening is fully metabolized, it's not separate from doing the dishes, going to work, having conversations. It's simply the recognition that all of this is it. There's no sacred versus profane. It's all the sacred play of consciousness. So perhaps the real secret, if there is one, is not a set of truths to be hoarded, but a way of being that doesn't need to announce itself. You don't need to tell people you're awakened. They'll sense it in how you listen, in your lack of agenda, in your comfort with not knowing, in your acceptance of what is. These qualities speak louder than any spiritual discourse, and yet there is a place for sharing when it's appropriate. Not sharing what you know, but sharing how you see. Not teaching, but exploring together. Not as someone who has arrived teaching someone who hasn't, but as awareness recognizing itself in another form. This kind of sharing has a completely different quality. It's collaborative rather than hierarchical. It's humble rather than authoritative. The ultimate reason to be quiet about your awakening is that the awakening itself teaches you the futility of trying to change others. Not because you don't care, but because you see that each person's journey is perfect exactly as it is. Everyone is exactly where they need to be for their own awakening to unfold. Your job isn't to wake them up. Your job is to be awake yourself and to be available if they ask for directions. You've probably discovered that the people who are most helped by your awakening aren't the ones you tried to convince with words. They're the ones who, just being around you, felt something shift. They couldn't articulate what it was, but something in your presence gave them permission to relax their own seeking, to be more present, to trust their own seeing. This is the real transmission, not from mind to mind, but from being to being. It happens in silence more often than in speech. It happens through presence more than through explanation. And it happens when you're not trying to make it happen. When you're simply being what you are, without any agenda to fix or save or enlighten anyone. So, these 5 secrets: the fiction of the separate self, the loss of the doer, the primacy of now, the recognition of yourself as awareness, and the realization that there's nowhere to go aren't really secrets at all. They're simply aspects of awakened seeing that can't be transmitted through concepts alone. They require a shift in the very ground of perception itself. And that shift can't be forced, can't be rushed, can't be given by one person to another. It can only be recognized when the time is right, when the seeking has exhausted itself, when the mind becomes quiet enough to notice what's always been present. Your awakening doesn't obligate you to wake others. It simply invites you to live from that awakening with authenticity and compassion. Keep these insights to yourself, not as secrets to be hoarded, but as treasures to be lived. Let your life be the teaching. Let your presence be the pointer. And when someone truly asks, when they're genuinely ready, then share not as someone who knows, speaking to someone who doesn't, but as one expression of consciousness recognizing itself in another. Because ultimately, that's what you've realized, isn't it? There's no separation between teacher and student, awakened and unawakened, self and other. There's only this one awareness, appearing as all these different forms, playing all these different roles, including the role of the one who has awakened and the one who hasn't yet. And in that recognition, there's a profound relaxation. You don't need to save the world, because the world is already saved. You don't need to enlighten humanity, because humanity is already the light. You simply need to be what you are, knowing that what you are is what everything is, looking at itself through these particular eyes. At this particular moment, in this eternal now.